Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. It is November 3rd. Thanks for joining me bright and early on this Sunday, although it's an hour later than it seems, right? Because we just changed the clocks, especially to those of you in California and on the West Coast who got up to join. Truly appreciate it. It's just now 10 a.m. Eastern time, so we're going to give it one more minute, and then we'll begin. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. It is the week of November 6th, 2024. Very big week for the United States of America and for the rest of the world. Today's episode is called Long Division. And of course, I'll explain what that means when we get to it. First, a small piece of business. The Fall 24 fundraiser to support this podcast is now officially closed. So I will not be soliciting anymore. Those who want to give, the link will still be on the website at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. But moving out, I will not be mentioning it later on. And I truly want to thank everyone who contributed. My goal for this fundraiser was to raise $10,000 to cover the production costs, the music, the editing, everything that goes on behind the scenes. And I've gotten to over 9,000, which is pretty good for a first fundraiser. And I truly do appreciate everyone who gave. Some gave some very large amounts, some gave smaller. It all makes a difference. And just on a personal level, you got to understand when you do a podcast, a lot of us are familiar with the names, Joe Rogan, and then the very popular Call Her Daddy podcast and other big name podcasters. But most people who podcast are like me. They're someone in front of a computer and a mic in their kitchen or living room or wherever they happen to be, trying to share the ideas that mean a lot to them with those who care to hear about them. And you produce it and do it and never really know how it's affecting people because you don't get live feedback from an audience like you would in, say, a stand-up show. But to me, when I see this many people contributing and supporting the podcast, it shows me that it really is landing and that it's bringing meaning to you. And that's really the most important thing to me. So I truly thank you. Now, let's move on to this week's episode. We're going to begin with some questions that you sent in. So, from Johanna, with the upcoming American election just days away, which candidate would you vote for? And can you give us a perspective on which presidential candidate that Jewish Americans would vote for? Well, by the time this podcast is up on Apple and on Spotify, the election will be over. That's not to say that we will have a result by then. I kind of talked last week about who I might vote for. I'd rather like to take sort of a different turn on this question because it is still relevant. I want to tell you about what Israelis are thinking in a little more depth. So, first of all, Israelis overall, 20% say that they're just not sure. So that only leaves 80% to answering surveys or even giving a choice of some sort. And of those 80%, Israelis favor Trump 2-1. Now, how about Americans living in Israel who say that they are going to vote? If you're an American living in Israel, you can vote in American federal elections. It is complicated. There's a lot of paperwork and notaries that you have to go through to file and get your absentee ballot, but it is possible. And Americans living in Israel, they support Trump by a margin of about 3-1. And you can wonder, why is that? Certainly for the Americans living in Israel who vote, that's not exactly a clean sample size. You're looking at Americans who are going to take the time to go through all of that bureaucracy in order to vote. I think you also have to take into account that most Americans who are making aliyah to Israel these days are not secular, and they're not even reform or conservative Jews. Most of them are kind of from the modern Orthodox background. Not all by any means, but just anecdotally, that's what I'm seeing. Those are the families that are moving to Israel. So again, it's not a pure sample size of Americans. But we should still ask, why so much favorability towards Trump? And I'll tell you what Israelis in general are seeing. Number one, in the Biden administration, and they assume it'll be the same or worse with Kamala Harris, they're seeing an unwillingness to support Israel unequivocally. I mean, for us in Israel, this is an open and shut case. This is Israel against brutal terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran. There's nothing gray here. And yes, sadly, many civilians have been killed in Gaza. But again, it's because our enemies choose to use their civilians as human shields. So to us, we are doing the dirty work of the world. We are helping to save the world from Iran, from its proxies. And in return, we would expect unequivocal support from our greatest ally. And we're not really seeing that. We're seeing a lot of hedging. We're seeing a lot of hand wringing. We're seeing a lot of, yes, we support Israel, but we also have to keep in mind the casualties in Gaza, which sends the message that Israel is responsible for those casualties. And that's just bewildering to Israelis, and including bewildering to me, because again, this is black and white. This is an open and shut case. So, number two, what we're also seeing in Israel is a real passiveness in America among the leadership, an unwillingness to use American power. I mean, the Houthis, for example, have disrupted shipping for how long now? Several months in the Suez Canal region, and yet America can't handle them, isn't doing anything about it. America has all this muscle, but it's afraid to use it. And so, Israel again is wondering, what kind of ally do we have if all of their firepower is actually amounting to nothing, has no value? Why be so passive? Why be so weak? And they assume that Trump would not be. Number three, Trump did do some things that Israel sees as positive. The Abraham Accords, bringing the embassy to Jerusalem, however important you feel that is. And there's this also feeling that Trump will allow Israel to do what it needs to win these wars that we're fighting against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Now, I want to point out that might be mistaken. Trump is erratic. You never know who he's going to support. You never know who he's going to say or side with. I personally think he's mostly out for himself as opposed to having any geopolitical stance that he can return to. But here's another question that I'm going to flip and present to you guys. If you were Hezbollah, or you were Hamas, or you were Iran, who would you want to win the election? My guess, and I don't know, but my guess is you wouldn't want Trump to win. You would want Harris to win. So that's another way to think about this. Okay, next question. This one's from Jill in Jacksonville, and I just had dinner with Jill last week during my comedy and book tour when I was in Jacksonville for the weekend. A bunch of us went out, the whole committee, and Jill, it was good to meet you in person, and thanks for this question. She writes, any updates about the hostages? I can't even imagine the hell they are living in. Well, first of all, none of us can imagine the hell they are living in. Second of all, it's amazing to me how much the hostages do seem to have dropped off the table as a piece of conversation. Around the world, maybe I'm less surprised that it's become less of a conversation point, but even in Israel, we are talking about it less and less. We know they're there. It bothers us. We're horrified, but it's not gnawing at us. It doesn't overtake us the way it did even 3 months ago, but certainly a year ago. I hate to say it, but we are adapting a little bit to the idea that there are hostages there, and we are not riled up with the anger, the disgust, the frustration that we should be. I think part of it is simply hopelessness. I think most of us believe that we don't truly have a partner that we even could negotiate with. I mean, say what you want about Netanyahu and how much he's actually trying to get a deal. The bottom line is, I don't think many of us believe that we actually have a partner on the other side who knows where the hostages are and who could gather the hostages into a central point to release them, and who actually has the power to contact the various groups that are holding hostages. Remember, it's not just Hamas. It's also Islamic Jihad, also some other small terror factions. It's also ordinary civilians. So this whole idea that killing Sinwar meant that, we on the one hand got Sinwar, but on the other hand, we don't know who to talk to now. We don't have a central address with whom to negotiate. I don't know how much that is true. And this goes into the next question. Sherry wrote in, I heard in the Times of Israel that there's speculation that now that Sinwar has been eliminated, those who are holding hostages in Gaza may see that their ship is sinking and want to make a deal with Israel. What are your thoughts? And again, I don't know that the Sinwar being eliminated really opens up that many opportunities because again, how do you collect them? If these families do want to give up hostages, what do? Walk them to the border, make a phone call? I don't think it's really clear. I don't know that those holding hostages would necessarily trust Israel when it says, give us the hostages and no harm will be done to you. So, in terms of hostages being released, I don't see Sinwar's elimination as that much of a game changer. And sadly, I don't really see any progress coming soon. I mean, there are talks supposedly happening, but Hamas has said over and over, and they still say, the leaders they have now, the council, they are saying that unless Israel withdraws from Gaza completely, they are not open to any sort of hostage discussion. Now you ask, are there any updates, Joe? Well, the one update we have is from a young girl named Agam Goldstein Almog. She was held hostage in Gaza for several weeks with her mother and two younger brothers, and she released a picture on her Instagram account, I believe it was over the weekend, showing her in the tunnel in Gaza and really imploring the government. She was freed in the first deal, but she's in this post on Instagram. She showed this picture of her and her brothers and said, you must do everything you can to get the remaining hostages out. It's been over 400 days. Where are you? Really calling on the government to get them out of the hell that she says that she went through just for those several weeks. So sadly, that is all of the updates we have right now. Final question. Andrew wrote in, Joel, a couple of weeks ago on your podcast, you interviewed Amanda Borschel Don, who is the host of the Times of Israel Daily Briefing podcast, which is a great one. And she shared with you that she was not religious and that she has 7 children. I found that interesting, albeit even if my thought was a bit ignorant. My assumption was that only religious families in Israel have that many kids. How common is it in Israel to have a large family like that when you're not religious? So yes, Amanda Borsheltan has 7 kids. I will say it is not common. It tends to be the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox families who have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or more children, not secular Israelis like Amanda. But of course, that's not to say it doesn't happen. I did a little research for this, and it turns out that the average Israeli secular family, so the average not religious modern Orthodox and not Haredi family, so the average Israeli, as we say in Hebrew, Chiloni secular family, has just about 3 kids, over 3 kids. Now compare that to the average American family has just around two kids, maybe a little bit less. So the question still is, if Israel is such an expensive country, which I have told you so many times, it's very expensive to live in Israel. Almost impossible at this point to buy a house in Israel. Families live in the red. They live with a minus in their bank account just to make life work. If that's the case, why are families still having over three children per family in Israel? And the reason is, and I wrote about this in Israel 201, the reason is it's in our blood. It's in our DNA to have big families. It's the Jewish thing. Even when a young couple gets married in Israel and they have no income and no jobs yet, people will say, "No, so when you bring in kids, it's that Jewish longing for children and keeping the people going." And I don't really see that changing because it's just part of who we are. So despite the fact that it's economically difficult and challenging to raise families in Israel, I do see that trend continuing. Now, it might be going down maybe a little less in the future, but in general, Israelis believe in having children. It's the Israeli thing to do. It's one of those, it's why it's one of the things you live for in Israel when you are Israeli. And it's very, very few people just say, I don't want kids and don't subscribe to that notion of family at all. Okay, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come right back with some perspectives on this week's news. I do want to remind everyone that the chat is for sharing ideas about Israel or sharing the names of organizations where we can contribute to Israel, not for political back and forth, certainly not for accusations. I have in the past reached out to some individuals personally and said, "Hey, you need to tone down your posts or else I'll remove you." And I would hate to have to do that, but if it ever got to the point where it was too much, I would bar some people from the pod. Again, don't want to have to do that, but please use the chat for the right reasons. Okay, welcome back to Inside Israel. Let's quickly take a look at three stories from this week. And I consider these stories very off the radar. I don't know if they got any coverage in general American and world press. I consider these really small and off the radar stories. And yet, what we're going to do, as always, is look at the Israeli perspective on them. What are Israelis saying? So the first one is this very daring raid in northern Lebanon, in which a small special forces IDF unit went in and captured a very high naval officer in the Hezbollah naval forces. This was the Shayetet 13 unit, Shayetet 13, which is also known as the Navy SEALs. And again, they went in and they were able to capture one of the highest naval officers in Hezbollah's maritime force. So what's significant about this? First of all, it took place 140 kilometers away north of Israel's border with Lebanon. That's about 90 miles north of Israel's border with Lebanon. So that really sends a message to Hezbollah and to Israel's enemies that we can and we will get you anywhere. We're not just going over the border a couple miles. We will go anywhere in Lebanon and really anywhere in the world. So it's a message to our enemies. Okay. Number two, it really makes Hezbollah once again look foolish. And so much of the Middle East and in the Arab world in particular is about saving face and about coming across as strong and not looking weak. In the fact that we were able to go 90 miles into their territory, arriving by sea in a very clever Entebbe style operation it makes us look like we have the upper hand once again. A trend we're seeing lately with pagers and radios exploding, with taking out Nasrallah and his next in line. And we need to keep doing these kind of operations just to keep pounding away at the face and how the enemy is presented to the rest of the world. So, third significant angle of this story, it is going to give us intelligence. He's been brought back to Israel and he will be grilled by Israel's human intelligence unit to get information on Hezbollah's plans, on the naval forces in particular, but also Hezbollah in general. So that's a real plus for Israel, obviously. And four, finally, this kind of raid is another sign to Israelis that badass Israel is back and here to stay. One of the most demoralizing aspects of October 7th, besides all the horror and the carnage, was the fact that our army let us down and that clever, badass Israel was nowhere to be seen for that entire day. The more Israel can see these kinds of operations, the more it's good for the Israeli soul, the more it reminds us that it is still good to live in Israel and safe to live in Israel. So that is significant too. I just want to point out that in about a week from now, on November 14th, I will be emceeing a fundraiser for Israel's Navy SEALs called the Shayetet 13. If you want to attend this fundraiser, it's in New York City. So just drop me an email through my website, joelchasnoff.com, and I'll send you the information. You do have to buy tickets, make a contribution, but it's really, really fascinating. They have a lot of former Navy SEALs there who'll be telling stories. They might be speaking a little bit more about this operation to the extent that they can. And they're a great organization in general. It's called AFINS, AFINS, American Friends of Israel's Navy SEALs. Again, email me for the info. Okay, second piece of news. There's been a leak of a document, several documents from the Prime Minister's office in Israel. This is sort of a trend of documents being leaked. But right now, there's a major investigation going on in Israel with an arrest. Who from the Prime Minister's office released this document? This document related to a hostage deal. And in the document, it noted that we had uncovered evidence that Hamas's true aims is to secure the release of prisoners and not to protect civilians. This was in the document that we found written by Hamas, where they pretty much admitted that protecting civilians was not one of their goals. So the question is, who from the Prime Minister's office would leak this? Now, why does this matter? Well, this leak helps Netanyahu because all this time Netanyahu has not had a hostage deal. People have been saying, oh, it's because you want to just protect your own political ambitions. You're only looking out for yourself. And here, this is evidence that seems to say, actually, Hamas doesn't really want a deal. What they really want is the release of prisoners. They don't care for their own civilians. So it makes Netanyahu look a little better. Why this is significant to Israelis, though, is that this is part of a trend where we really, every day, are losing more and more trust in the prime minister and in the prime minister's office. So it'll be interesting to see how this story unfolds. I can't say it's a major story that's shocking Israel, but many are following it, and it's part of this trend we see of, the prime minister seemed to jockey for himself at the same time that he's also trying to conduct these now not even two, but I would say three wars against Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. The third and final news story, and this is the source of the title of this podcast episode, Long Division. The Knesset approved a bill that would provide subsidized daycare for ultra-Orthodox families in which the father is obligated to serve in the IDF but does not serve. Okay, so let's just spell that out. You have ultra-Orthodox families where the father has been called to serve in the IDF, but he refuses to serve. He dodges the draft. These families would still now receive free daycare provided by the state and paid by taxpayers like me and others, which clearly is unfair to all of those who are serving in the IDF right now. And it's another example of how the Haredi ultra-Orthodox population It's why Israelis see them as pariahs, as those who just feed off the state but don't contribute anything in return. Naftali Bennett came out against this very vehemently. And I would say look for Bennett to make a serious run for prime minister whenever the next elections are held. He's polling very high, and he seems to be the one person at this point who could really defeat Netanyahu if they were to go head to head. Even Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, was against this bill. Now, normally he always sides with the ultra-Orthodox, but here he was against it, saying that he would only approve it if preferential treatment were also given to families of reservists. Now, I don't know what that means, preferential treatment to families of reservists. I don't know if it means that reservists serving in Gaza and Lebanon, that their families would also get free daycare, or I don't know what that means, but he's at least aware of the blatant unfairness of this kind of a bill that once again is favoring the ultra-Orthodox. And I think even more surprising and significant is that we've seen a turn lately that many families of modern Orthodox soldiers, these are, Kippas Ruga, Nit Yarmulke families, Bnei Akiva families, they've suffered a lot of losses in Lebanon, in Gaza lately. A number of soldiers who've been killed lately, I'd say maybe the majority who've been killed lately in Gaza and in Lebanon, come from these ultra-Orthodox families. And their families are now being vocal. They're coming out and saying that it is unfair that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, are not serving, especially because they claim they're not serving because it contradicts their studies of Torah. And what these ultra-Orthodox, what these modern Orthodox families are saying is that we study Torah too. Torah is just as much a part of our lives as it is your lives, but we also make our Torah study mesh with serving the country and defending the country. And that is actually a mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah. So they're trying to flip this argument around, and they're coming out very vocally against the ultra-Orthodox. It really goes back to what I've said over and over on this podcast, that Israel's most serious problem is the internal one. We are able to figure out solutions to Hamas, Hezbollah, even to Iran. We are struggling right now to figure out how to handle this internal problem of what kind of Jewish state are we going to be? Do certain Jews get preferential treatment? How do you remain Jewish but also progressive? How do you remain Jewish but also democratic and fair? This is the question that faces Israel in the long term, this kind of long division, more than any other. Thank you for joining me on this week's broadcast. Our next one is going to be next Sunday. The next live broadcast will be next Sunday, November 10th. This one a little bit later at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I can't do evening once again simply because of the tour schedule, but it will be at 11 a.m. next Sunday, November 10th, and that will be announced and the link shared in the newsletter. If you're not signed up for the newsletter, it's joelchasnoff.com. Scroll down to the bottom. You'll see a newsletter called Hebrew is Magic. Put your name and email in, and you will get the link every week. I wish all of you a good, safe week. No matter what happens election-wise, the world will still be here next Sunday when we talk again, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. Until then, toda rabah, everyone, and lehitraot.